Okay, so I'm going to talk about, actually entitled the talk Reimagining the Commons, and I'll come back to, you'll see later why that is. And I'm really trying to explore the balance between economic activity, environmental management and control. Can we do those things sustainably? Can we have economic activity and sustainable economic activity and environmental sustainability working together rather than working in opposition with each other? I'm going to talk through what we've been doing for the Skyline project over the last couple of years, where a lot of where we work and a lot of the photographs and the anecdotes I'm telling today are based in the Upper Rhondda. And this is the very top of the Rhondda looking south down towards Cardiff. And I just want to put this photograph in because it's Iron Age settlements up at the top above Blind Rhondda. And it's just a reminder, this is not, we think about the Rhondda, we think about coal, we think about the history as just being the last 200 years. And this goes back 3,000 years where humans have been using and managing that landscape in a way which is very, very different from the way we think of it now. And it's a long history and it's not just a coal history. This guy is important. This is William Herbert, and he was granted a lot of the lands around what is now Herbert by Edward VI in 1547. It's his descendants who will become the Marquis of Bute. And I suppose one of my themes here is about capital and control of landscape outside of the area, and with how we can change and reverse that where we can. And it's the Marquis of Bute, so 300 years later, 1845, the Marquis of Bute, descendant of William Herbert, is buying up the farmland. He already owns a lot of the common land, the bigger, higher land around it, and he starts buying up the farmland. The reason why? He has the capital and there's coal. And it's just 10 years later, after he's finished buying up the land in 1855, that the Bute Merthyr Colliery opens. Now, this colliery actually is going to close in 1926. The window for operation for many of these collieries is very small, and it absolutely transforms the landscape, the places. In 1821, I think the census for this area of Herbert had about 200 people living in it. They would have been small farmers. It's going to rise to well over 15,000 because of the coal and because of the industry that's coming in. It isn't just about coal. You have other industry. The Polycot factory is opened, and at its peak is it going to employ 1,500 people in the town. It's a clothing factory. It gets bought by Burberry in 1989, and it closes in 2007. Globalization, the jobs going out to the Far East. And that's worth mentioning as well, that it's not just coal and the coal mines closing, it's other industry and the impact of globalization on the community, which has added to the impacts on the place. This is taken from a very similar place looking north as that photograph of the Merthyr Bute Colliery. And this is as it is today. We've got the forestry, we've got the town, we've got the back-to-back houses that were there that were built in the 19th century for the coal workers. And we've got a landscape which is very much recovering, the nature coming back into the valley, but a community which is still suffering from high levels of deprivation, unemployment. It is only an hour, but it's only less than 20 miles from Cardiff, but it's over an hour on the train. It's a slow process, it's a slow journey, and psychologically it's a different world than what we have at the moment. This photograph is important because the economic activity that's in this valley now is commercial forestry and commercial wind. The Pennacomoy wind farm is there, the 300 megawatt 76 turbine wind farm is on the top. Yes, there is a small community fund which gives cash to the community, but largely that is out of area capital, harvesting the benefits. There are no jobs, or very, very few jobs associated with the wind farm. There are no jobs in the valley associated with the forestry. The forestry is commercial forestry, but it's out of area capital, in this case Welsh Government Woodland Estate, NRW, and it's out of area contractors. The revenue and the jobs are leaving the valley and not contributing to its prospects. So we've got, there's from those economic activities which are there today, there are no local jobs, there's very little or no local income, and certainly no control over the decisions and what's happening in the place. So partly against that background, I started the Skyline project, which was a feasibility study. And it was a feasibility study set to try to reconnect the people of, in fact, we worked in 3 communities across the valleys: Herbert, Unasowen in Merthyr, and Caira in Bridgend. And it was to try to reconnect people with landscape, psychologically, economically, for the long term. This is a photograph of Herbert High Street as it is taken a year ago. And what most people don't realize, and people think I doctored this photograph, this is the photograph, that is the forest, that's how close it is. The proximity between the high street, the shops, the day-to-day, the everyday, and what is the commercial forestry estate is absolutely, this is, yeah, you cross the railway tracks behind the houses, you cross the railway track, you're into the forest. It's absolutely adjacent, and yet it means it has no connection with the people that were there. The feasibility study set out to answer 4 questions. Do communities want to be stewards of their landscape? Now, part of the inspiration for this came from Scotland. And in Scotland, we've had 25 years of community land ownership. The Scottish Parliament, when it came in 1997, and even before that, 1 or 2 of the examples, the Isle of Egg, set about taking control. There are now 200 community land projects in Scotland. I think they own something like 6% of the land area of Scotland, entirely creating really strong economic connections. So part of what we were trying to do was, is there a model for how getting some of the benefits of that change into Wales, within the Welsh different history and the different legislative environment? Do communities want to be stewards of the landscape was the first question. The very, very important second question was, are there sustainable business models? So what the Scottish communities have managed to do is, without further grant income, they've actually managed to create sustainable business models which keep them going, which can free them from grant dependency, which is what, to me, is one of the most important elements of control. Okay, you can have control to exercise or discover nature in your woodland, but actually, do you have the rights to make money from it? Can you be sustainable? Is that money which is in your control of how you spend it, not in the decisions of a grant committee who almost certainly don't live in the area? So we're looking for sustainable business models. Does the community, can they and do they want to manage those business models in a way which is also good for nature? And this, in some ways, that's the big question for this discussion. And just as importantly, how do they get governed? How do you govern? What is landscape scale stewardship or ownership projects? What is the governance model? How does that fit in with the public electoral processes in the local councils? About a year ago, we published a feasibility study. The Skyline feasibility study is available on the website. We've captured all of the learnings. I mean, the answers to those 4 questions, save you reading all the way through it, is yes, although there was some suspicion about what we were up to at the beginning, there was, by the end of the feasibility study process, there was a lot of enthusiasm, and there still is a lot of enthusiasm for community stewardship, for control over that landscape, for things. So it's something that's it's a genie we can't put back into the bottle. There are sustainable business models. We looked at what's in Scotland, and we looked at what the opportunities are here. In the essence, they revolve around forestry. It'll be forestry, it's energy generation, and perhaps food production. There are other things, and tourism and other activities that can be brought together, but those are the ones. And they're something like forestry income. It's not very risky. It's fairly predictable. It can be managed in a very good way. The nature issue, the governance issue. I'll just come back. Actually, the nature issue. I'll come on to that nature issue, and I'll share some of the thoughts that the community had about how given the opportunity, how would they manage that landscape? And these competing strains of economic activity, sustainable income, jobs, and nature. The governance one was very important. And I suppose in a way I picked out these two photographs to contrast an old style men in suits planning a landscape and saying what should happen to it. And on the right, the community, and this was a group from the community. We went up onto the top of the hill and spent a fantastic hour pointing, looking, dreaming, thinking how it could be different. The process, I'll say a little bit about this because it was important. The process of getting to the community it's not easy. We turned up, I turned up. This is an idea from out of area. This is me taking some knowledge from Scotland and dropping it into the valleys and saying, hey, what about this? And there was quite a lot of suspicion. And we didn't just do the usual workshops and charrettes and sticky notes on maps. We started, first of all, we employed artists right from the start. In all of the communities we work with, we employed artists. And I'm not now looking back, I'm not sure why I did that, but it was probably the best thing that we did. And something about involving artists to share food, to write poems, to create art, and work with the people there, helped to engage the heart before the brain. And we got a complete engagement with what was going on. And one of the activities that was very powerful was remembering. Remembering what's been lost. And this is a process that the community is involved in here on this. They're remembering what has changed, what has gone, what's been lost, and finding the values. And we did that first before we started imagining what the future might be. Let's look back into the past. And it wasn't just living past, it wasn't just to the coal mines. We went right back to the Bronze Age settlements, even back to the Ice Age. And it's quite interesting, if you do that, the importance of the 200 years of industrial and coal extraction shrinks. More relevance and importance is given to the periods when it wasn't agricultural, when and incomes and livelihoods were being created from the land in ways that weren't about extraction of commercial energy, commercial timber, or coal. And so that remembering and going back and sharing those memories was a very important part of the process. We also did things that just were a bit bonkers. These were 3 artists walking through the streets of Aberfan on a rainy Sunday with a giant dream catcher, engaging locals in conversation and getting to capture their dreams for the future of the valley onto ribbons, which they walked through the town. It sounds a bit contrived, but it worked. And the richness of the conversations that happen with the individuals about place, their history of the place, their perception of place, their dreams for the future, are much richer than you might get in a traditional workshop. One of the things that we did, we worked with children. We worked with children on poetry. We shared food. I mean, it's really simple, but let's share. Let's bring together. Let's make it fun. Let's have a sense of community and conviviality. And out of those meetings, out of that meal, came conversations and a lowering of barriers and a coming together to talk about a future, which perhaps I think would have been really difficult again without making that effort or that things. And you can see the photograph on the bottom left. Some of the passion that was unleashed, that belief, that energy to change is one of the things that we really established. There's also more technical stuff. There's looking at maps. There's looking at what's feasible, what's practical. One of the things that we had to do was it wasn't just down to the community to come up with what they wanted to do and that was it. We had to feed in technical expertise, but we did that in a way which always left the community in control of what the outcome and the decisions were. So we needed to use ecologists. We needed to use energy specialists. We needed to have a timber consultant to feed into the process, not to say you need to do this, but to inform the decision-making process so that it was an informed decision. Very clear that the power needs to retain with the people, the residents, but they typically won't have that level of ecological and technical expertise which is needed to guide the decisions. So it's a question of bringing together community, resident and expertise to shape priorities and to come up with a plan for the future. And one of the other important things about the plan for the future, and I do think is important, we set the timescale very, very long. We were talking about 100 years, 3 generations, not the usual 5 years of a lottery project or 3 years, but actually starting to imagine what the place could look like in 3 generations' time. It's what long established landowners do. It's what the family estates do. The family estates will plan for 3 generations' time, and that's not a capacity that residents in the place, they don't have planned any, don't have any capacity to plan for any period of time, but actually that's 3 generations. And one of the maybe it shouldn't have been a surprise, but one of the surprises for me was the vigor which residents in their 70s and 80s put into imagining the landscape in 100 years' time. And that was something that will really stick with me. It mattered. It mattered that for once they could have a say and were being listened to. This is a poem that was created out of verbatim statements that we caught from some of the residents in some of these various activities that we were doing. You can read the whole thing if you want to. It's a collection. It's just a collection of actual statements by residents about the village. But I've just picked out three things in the red. I want round trees, not pointed ones. It's about in their own language. This is about ecology. This is about environment. This is about a landscape which is better for nature. We need jobs for the kids. This is about creating opportunities, economic opportunities, reasons to stay in the community, reasons to stay in the valley. And my favorite one there might be wolves. It's also very importantly about imagination. It has to be about that, blending those 3 things together. There's another way of saying it. It is about the economy. It's about the everyday, and by the everyday I mean access tracks, walking, keep fit trails, cycle trails, places for the school to do forest school activities, maybe a performance space. Those are the things as well. And what came across really strongly from all of our consultations was that, and I will tell you that most of the communities we spoke to had never heard of the Wellbeing Act. So the Future Generations Act, no, not heard of it. What's that? And yet they instinctively, because it's the place they lived in, had an intrinsic sense of balance between the objectives of ecology, day-to-day culture, and jobs. It wasn't, oh great, we can cut the trees down, make some money and spend it on a swimming pool. It wasn't that at all. It was that balance. And so it was all there. The people who live in a place care for a place in a way which is complex and multifaceted. And the legislation is great, but it wasn't what was driving the outcomes. What I've got here is, these are the list of things that have been filtered through technical experts across all 3 places that we wanted, that the community would put on their priority list. The ones in red are the ones which have got business models, sustainable business models associated. The ones in green don't have sustainable business models, but they wanted to do them. And in a sense, the implication was that cash from the commercial activities could be used to fund the other activities. And so you got this balance straight away. But it was energy generation, commercial horticulture, commercial forestry, timber processing, some tourism. But on the non-commercial side, and this was an extraordinary vision, which I think I'm very much hoping we're going to get a chance to deliver on, turning the Kumsar Bren Basin, which is in that photograph above Herbert High Street, that is that basin, into a 200-hectare nature reserve. It'll take 10 or 20 years to do it, but actually we can create right next to the town, adjacent to the train station, 200-hectare naturally regenerated nature reserve. It would be quite amazing. Community orchards, coppice plantings, access tracks, forest crofts, getting people to have a completely different relationship. We saw this in Scotland, Forest Crofts, where families could take over a section of old forestry land, build a house, build a low impact house and live there. A completely different relationship between living and landscape than we currently have in these places. Green gyms, cabin in the woods, performance spaces, green burial woodland is a very popular idea, and one that it came up in several other communities, and one they very much like to develop. I've nearly finished the slides. I've nearly finished my talking. We can get on to the questions. This is a slightly more academic look of it, and this is why I called the talk Reimagining the Commons. This actually is from, this is a slide that Jenny Wong put together a few years ago, and the data is taken from Ostrom. You can see the credits at the bottom. But it's an interesting contrast. What we're talking about in a way is seeing the landscape as, and imagining as a new common. And they're different from the old commons. And there's some quite interesting points. I'll share the presentation. I won't go through all of these points. But the old commons were for the benefit of economic benefit of a few of the commoners, but they are tending to disappear. The new commons are emerging. This is the new commons, if you like, is what's happening in Scotland to a very extent. With common motivation and interest, run by works and management plans rather than customary law. A lot of freedom, open membership rather than the closed membership of the old commons, and the benefits of delivering various public goods rather than an income stream for a few. And it's an interesting contrast. And in some ways, what we're trying to do here is reimagine the notion of what a common is, but for a modern age with difference, and that the contrast between the traditional commons and what I think the new commons is an interesting area for exploration and discovery. I'm going to end with a quote, which I'm not going to read it all out, you can read it yourself, but I'm going to pick out the 3 words which are in italics, which actually, it's from the book Soil and Soul, which I strongly recommend to anybody. It's by Alistair McIntosh, cover and photograph there. Alistair was one of the pioneers of the Scottish land reform movement, and he was one of the people who led the first community buyout of the Isle of Egg. And the Soil and Soul tells in part the story of that buyout and how the community came together, how they turned from being tenants on an island to owning the island, and the transformation that it brought to the society and to the culture and the way. And that's a model that then got replicated 200 times across Scotland again and again. But it's much more than just the story of that. It's also a reflection, a philosophical and theological reflection on ownership and land and community and culture. And he has this process in which he talks about remembering, revisioning and reclaiming. And we use those 3 words in our processes that we went through. So the remembering what's been lost, remembering what was and what has been lost and what you would like to recapture. And then you can engage in revisioning, come together with a shared sense of what has been lost to envision a new future. And finally, and this is the place we're at now, and it does need, dare is the right word, dare we reclaim? Can we actually, as a society, as a community, can we then reclaim some of control back that has been taken away, has been given to public and private institutions who make the decisions about the place that we live in? Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. That was really, really interesting. We do have a raised hand from somebody, so from David Smith, so I will allow him to talk.
Hello. Yeah, I raised my hand at the beginning to say I was attending, so I didn't see any attendance.
Now you can start with a question.
I hope I'm not the only one here.
No.
That was great. that was a great talk, and I like, obviously, I'm a landscape architect, and I like everything you're saying. The social aspect of it, yes, it's great. Get the people to move towards ownership of where they are, and if that can be extended out into the commercial areas, that's all well and good. My question is really, well, I've seen lots of regional land plans and land use plans. So clearly there isn't an inch of space in our small collection of islands that hasn't been designated. It's probably one of the most intense places I've ever lived. There's all sorts of legislation covering every square foot, or every square meter, I should say. Did you show those plans? Did you convey to the people that came and got together? Did you show them that all of these lands have designations, and one of the obstructions is going to be, dismantling some of that. If they wish to get involved, they're going to have to dismantle some of the barriers of legislation. And do they grasp that? Because it's all very well to have these great dreams, but I would have thought there are huge barriers in land use legislation to overcome as well.
No, it's a good question. We did one of our technical experts was a planning consultant, and it's briefly covered in the feasibility study, not in great depth because there was things. But we looked at in each of the three places, we looked at the zoning and the planning restrictions and what could be done. And yes, it needs a lot can be done. I mean, the energy generation. A lot of the land we're looking at, around Herbert is public land. It's the Welsh Government woodland estate, and it's already commercially, it's commercially managed for forestry. There are already subleases for energy generation for the wind farm, for a community hydro that's there. So those things can be. It doesn't mean the planning processes aren't difficult, but it can be done. I think something like forest crofting might be a challenge, although I think we could probably get there under one planet development legislation. I think we've got the tools. I think I'm not an expert. I mean, I'm not an expert, but I'm told that we have the tools. It's a question about having the will, the political will, and locally to use them and to implement them. So there isn't much in the list that I think would need legislation change to do it.
Okay, glad to hear it. I suspect it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yes, I know. I am aware of that, but
you have to shake the trees to get the people involved. They can then approach the organisations.
Yeah. Now, it's different in Scotland. I mean, the legislative setting is different in Scotland. The planning system, I guess, is different. I'm not an expert. I don't know. But one of them, we went to Kilfinnan Community Forest, which had been running about 9 years. It's in Argyll. Interestingly, it overlooks the Isle of Bute, where, of course, the Marquis of Bute, who owned a lot of the forestry in the Upper Rhondda, also owns and also lives. So we met up, the two communities, we met up in the pub in Kilfinnan. And we started swapping stories about various ancestors of the Marquis of Bute, who had dominated in various ways both of their lives, 400 miles apart. But they put up one of the things that was most impressive. They've set up their own local forestry, a very small scale sawmill. They process their own timber. They don't do the felling. They get a contractor in to do the felling, but they specify what timber they want for processing. And they've used it, and it's low-grade timber that couldn't normally be used for construction, but they've developed a new construction method which uses on a log, a sort of a log cabin basis. And they've got building regs approval for it. They've got planning permission. They've put up 5 social housing units, which cost 40,000. They're 3-bedroom flexible social housing units, almost zero emission, and they cost £40,000 each to build. And they were training opportunities. They're using the local timber. It's construction skills. It's very low cost, and they had to get planning. It's not, it's not a pirate project. It's all fully permissioned, and it was absolutely inspiring what they'd done with what had just been another 300-hectare block of commercial forestry.
Now that would lead me to the second point: is once you've got you've already got commercial ownership in place to take a piece of land and provide it for any kind of development, there has to be a financial plan. And I would have said, if I was at that meeting, if I was a local and at that meeting, my first question would have been, can I get an income from whatever you're doing? Because I need a job. That's give people jobs with incomes, but then where does the money come to pay for that, role?
No, well, no, well, the very first, I can remember it very strongly. The very first meeting I held in Cairo, in Bridgend, we had about 40 of the locals there, and I stood up and I told my story about what I'd seen in Scotland, and and there was a guy in his 30s in the front row with his arms folded who just said, "Will there be jobs?" To which the answer is, well, that depends on what the community wants to do. I mean, the community, because it's about a transfer, to me, it's about a transfer of control. And so it's not to me to say what you should do with the landscape, it's what the community collectively wants to do with that landscape. And jobs can, and in the case of Scotland, is definitely part of it. Harvesting, timber processing, spin-off manufacturing, tourism, horticulture. These are all the things which they're not going to be huge. They're not going to employ 100 people. And they're certainly not going to be 35-hour-a-week jobs for 40 years with a pension. But there are opportunities to capture income from that land and keep it within the community, rather than it being taken off to following the out-of-area capital.
Lovely, thanks very much, Chris. We've got some raised hands and some questions, so it might be best to try and do them in the order that they've come in for fairness's sake. So you've got a question from Herbert saying, were there adjacent farms or other commercial interests that felt threatened by your approach, and how did you deal with them?
No, we didn't. We didn't have any issues with that. I'm going to have to distinguish. This was a feasibility study, and there is a difference between a feasibility study and doing it for real. We're now in the process of doing it for real in Herbert. We got Foundational Economy Challenge Fund money to set that up, to set up a land trust in Herbert, and that's what we're in the moment. Unfortunately, this hasn't been the best year for community engagement with COVID, and the Rhondda being in quite severe lockdown for quite a big chunk of it. So it's possible that we will encounter problems. The commercial interest, which is most difficult to reconcile, is that of NRW and the forest and the Welsh in the woodland estate. And there are interesting philosophical challenges here about, and which Scotland has tackled completely, and it's in legislation, but about a forest managed by professional foresters for the public purse in a general way. The cash goes off to Cardiff effectively, and how you reconcile that with benefits delivered, which are not all cash, but are health, psychological, cultural, to a limited community in one place. And what is the purpose of the estate? Is the estate to be managed commercially for maximum benefit, and that's the best thing to happen in a kind of statist approach, or are we going to devolve control and benefit to local people? So that, I suppose, that's the conflict which has come up most readily, which is similar to what you're saying, but not directly appropriate.
Okay, lovely, thanks, Chris. So we've got a question from Susan.
Yes, thank you, Chris. That was really interesting. It's kind of awkward speaking in this format because we can see you, but I don't think you can see us. But anyway, yes. Anyway, I just wanted to come back to this comment that you made about old and new ways of addressing the commons, and looking at Eleanor Ostrom and natural resource management and how she conceives it. I'm not really sure, Chris, I'd hold with too much the distinction between old and new ways of managing the commons, because I think that, yes, you're quite right that under the kind of rational governance model that we had brought down from the EU, and also through the kind of bureaucratization of everyday life, then yes, there has been a move to a kind of a management rather than a customary law approach towards natural resource management. But I think if you go back and have a look at Elinor Ostrom, actually what's really interesting is the way in which there's huge scope in Ostrom's model for having a combination of kind of new management techniques and what might be called customary practices. But also, if we look now as well at land management and natural resource management, there's a whole new space being made for customary knowledge or traditional knowledge, as well as traditional practices. And so it's much more open than a sharp distinction between the old and the new. What actually a lot of people are pushing for is a kind of combination of the customary knowledges and practices and approaches. And they're using Ostrom for this because they find a wealth of stuff in what she's doing. And there's some lovely examples from Slovakia and from the Czech Republic on forest management and how these have been combining these traditional customary practices with new management styles. Actually, to be clearer, it's not new management styles. They're combining it with co-production and participatory governance rather than top-down management. And so I think anyway, it's kind of common that it's not old and new. Actually, a lot of the work that's going on out there is trying to bring the two together over co-production and participatory, and also around issues of the use of knowledge and whose knowledge we're using. You know, is it the kind of managerial knowledge that comes from the scientist coming in and telling you what to do, or is it customary practices? For example, like in land management on the Aran Islands is a good example where you've got traditional customary practices about how you manage that land that have supported, you know, both income for people and livelihoods and also high biodiversity. So bodies like the IPBES are kind of running down that track, but also now the EU is backing off a bit from its top-down managerialism into something sometimes that might look like production. So anyway, there's
I guess I'm not expert enough to be able to answer it, but I take it more as a comment. I acknowledge what you're saying. I think there are some differences between the traditional, what these new commons, there are some differences about beneficiaries and governance rules and styles and all the rest of it. I mean, capturing some of the old knowledge, but these, I mean, if there was a common there before, it would have been an agricultural common hundreds of years ago. And the forest common there isn't knowledge. It was never there. It's a modern forest planted to modern commercial rules that has never had forest commoners as forest managers, and so there is a skill gap. We can learn from elsewhere. We can learn from all over Europe, but it's a new start, I would say.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Yes, for sure, it's a new start, particularly over forest management in Wales, which I think it's fair to say that the old Forestry Commission really wasn't interested in a whole wider agenda about what that management might be aimed towards. So there is a lot of new learning to do there, but I just don't want to make a sharp distinction between the old and the new, because I think sometimes we try too hard to make, and I'm not saying you're doing that, but we try too hard to make the new appear much newer than what it really is. Sometimes it's lesson learning from elsewhere, and sometimes it's combining old practices in new ways, and it's much more organic and evolving than it is such a sharp shift. But anyway, there's all kinds of exciting experiments going on in Slovakia and the Czech Republic over forest management, and actually in northern Sweden as well, that might combine old and new. Anyway, just a comment. But fascinating talk, Chris. Thanks a million.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks, Chris. Okay, we've got I suppose it's more of a comment from Ruth, and then another hand raised, and then a few more questions. So Ruth says, thank you, Chris, great talk. I like the idea of having an artist appointed to the start of the process to win hearts before minds. Also the intrinsic balance of the community. I wonder how this would transpose to an urban setting. Fascinating.
Well, I think this is, I mean, it felt like an urban setting. This is I think the geographers would call it a peri-urban setting. But Herbert's a town of 6,000 people. It's part of a continuous conurbation that joins to Cardiff. There are none of the residents earn their. I mean, one of the things that was really striking about the valleys to me is that there are no livelihoods in the landscape. In a rural setting, you've got people who are farmers or are, have jobs that relate to farming. They repair agricultural machinery, or they sell agricultural machinery, or there are land-related jobs. In the towns that we're looking in, there were none. There was no economic or social or cultural connection between the town and the land at all, even though they are adjacent. They're 10 feet apart. And so I'm no geographer. I wouldn't know how you classify it, but for me, these were and they felt like urban communities.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Chris. We've got another question from Eleanor, so I will just bring her up now. Okay.
Hi. Am I unmuted? Yes. Thanks, Chris. That was such an interesting talk. Thank you very much. So lots of ideas about what can be done, and your last comment about that connection in terms of what people do with their lives between where they live in the streets and the towns and the outside was also very interesting. But anyway, what I wanted to ask was, as well as the ideas about what you could do in the landscape, did you gain any knowledge about how to grow the confidence, the skills, the overall capacity within communities to take on and sustain initiatives in the longer term? And I guess I speak as someone who is involved in lottery funded projects, which you mentioned, and in terms of the short termism of lottery funded projects, but those are ultimately about delivering long-term outcomes. And very often what we see in those projects are issues around developing capacity and confidence to sustain benefits in the longer term. So I wondered whether you'd gained any kind of new insights from the community about what they needed in order to grow their own skills and confidence to develop and sustain initiatives to realise the vision.
Yeah. That's a very interesting question, and yes, I did. I went on a journey. I didn't understand this when I started, but I had a very tough question. I was one of the events, an older lady pinned me down and said, this is all a lie. You'll never. And Rich gave me a really, really hard time. Getting a big echo here. I don't know if someone could mute. Then, and I got thinking about it, and she said, well, there are all these projects and all these initiatives and all this money, and they fund these posts, and people come in and run these community development posts, and then the funding ends and they go away and nothing changes, and this will be just the same, won't it? She said, I mean, literally poking her finger in my chest. And we haven't done it yet, so I can't say that I've solved the problem. But the thing that really boils down to, I really believe this, and it came across very strongly, is control. What these communities in particular have not had is any say or control over their destiny. It is the council, it is Brussels, it has been Brussels, it was Westminster, it's now Cardiff, it's the local authority, it's the big employer. There's no sense of agency or control. And there's a social learned helplessness, which I think sets in. And I think I've seen this in Scotland, and there's some of the evidence, there's some academic research in Scotland on levels of civic engagement, which improve considerably, enormously, in places where land ownership, land stewardship is practiced on a large scale. So people become involved, and I think the skills are there. It's the belief, I don't think, there's all the skills you need in that community, but they need a place in which they feel it can make a difference, where there is an element of control, where the forest designs are not set in the forest manager's office 50 miles away without any consultation even. And I'm not talking about consultation, I'm talking about control. So for me, it's about, you have to give control. And that's a scary thing for a public authority to do. It's a very scary thing. Go to a public authority and say, don't worry, these people are amateurs, you're going to give them control now. But I think that's what it takes.
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Chris. So we've got another question from Rufan says, hi, Chris, how can we extract ideas and initiatives from remote communities with limited background of skills and education? How far can we as facilitators intervene on the ideation process?
Yeah, that's a good question. Another thing, one of the best things I did was we took people from the representatives from the 3 communities up to Scotland. We visited 3 projects in Scotland, and that's all we needed to do. That was the turning that was the turning point in terms of confidence that we could do it. Once people had seen it and seen what other people had done, then that's what they wanted to do. That was the and so just witnessing it, seeing it. And if we can get one project set up in Wales, then, you know, the next valley will be over, you know, the next week, and having a look and going, oh, right, okay. So I don't think you need to be told, they just need to see. And not everything applies to every place. But as I say, the things we saw in Scotland made a big impact. The timber harvesting, the timber processing, the renewable energy generation, the social housing using the local timber and the skills creation, the community polytunnel was there, the arts activities, the art and sculpture walk through the woodland. Just share it is what I would say.
Lovely, thanks, Chris. Okay, the next question comes from Ruth. It said, as well as capturing local ideas, are you finding enterprising people locally who may be the people to develop and commit to managing new business?
Yeah, well, yeah, no, it's. I think I understand what the question's about. I mean, the aim is we've got to we will put any land asset into the management of a community land trust, which will be a community organisation with community members, which is the model we saw a lot in Scotland, and it's not unusual in other community asset transfer projects across England and Wales. I don't see it's up for the community, but I don't see that they shouldn't and couldn't run all the opportunities. These create opportunities, entrepreneurial opportunities based on the asset. So the asset's in community control, but how it gets used and how it gets generated, I think we need to harness some of the entrepreneurship, which is definitely there. And so it isn't just committees of old men trying to run things, but actually it's creating, and there you'll get a lot more done if you can harness that entrepreneurial. I think if that's what your question was about, then that would be my answer. I'm not sure.
Thank you, Chris. So we've got a question from Yvonne who says, I'm working in Northern England. Can you recommend examples like Skyline and Kilvinnan that are operating within the English legal and land ownership system?
No. I've tried, well, there probably are some. I haven't looked too closely. Scotland is the place to go for reference projects, 200 community land ownership projects in Scotland across a whole host, some mainly rural, some urban. In England, there are a few, I think, but I'm not very aware of them. I mean, there are lots of asset transfer projects in England, but the crucial difference here, and I think this is the important difference, it needs to be asset transfer with an income potential so that it's economically self-sustaining and not having to write a funding application every 5 years for the lottery just to keep going. And that becomes very important. Whether there are any projects like that in England, I'm not sure. I've tried a little bit to reach out into England and to find out, and the relationship with the Forestry Commission in England, and a few links have been made, but I think it's applicable. I think it is the model needs, but I'm afraid I can't give you any reference projects. But if you find them, let me know.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Do have a couple more questions. We've got about 5 more minutes, so see if we can get through them. So it says, thanks, Chris. Could you say more about the good governance where you have active participation and good flow of information? I'm in Shetland, where a 250 million community fund is not accountable and transparent. How do you avoid the danger of the community management organisation becoming too powerful with access to too much capital?
Yes, that's an interesting one. I'm to some extent I'm not sure of the answer. I think you know the answers. The answers are transparency, involvement, engagement, communication, more transparency, being absolutely open. Some of the things we saw in Scotland were quite interesting. A smaller community, it auto-enrolled everybody into the community land trust. 600 people were auto-enrolled and you had to opt out. So rather than starting from 0 and getting to 10% engagement, they started with 100% and it got whittled down to about 90%. So it was quite brutal, but they got people engaged and involved. The trouble is the money, and I mean, other examples. I did a lot of work in community renewable energy, community scale energy. Some of the big community energy projects can have £1 million a year income, and it's run by a group of trustees, and the budget completely dwarfs the democratic elected town or parish council. And to me, there's a tension there, and I think we need to look at that, at how that happens. I'm not sure that these things actually should be independent of electoral processes, but they are, and then they're not connected yet. And I think that probably needs to be done. But you need to do it in a way which doesn't suck the power back to the authorities and stop anything happening and that sense of control. So I think it is a real issue. In the meantime, the projects that we saw in Scotland and the people I asked a lot of questions about governance and engagement and opposition. People don't like new things. So when it's new, the Kilfinnan project, when it was new, they were quite a lot of the community didn't like it. They weren't sure about it. It was always, it was a few pioneers who did it. They thought, the wood used to be neat and tidy, and now it's scruffy because it's got polytunnels and old vans in it, and what's the point? And it took them about, I said we were there 8-9 years after they started, and we were chatting in the pub with some of the local, we were questioning the locals. They weren't just listening to the trustees, but actually, go and talk to the guy at the bar. And now he says everybody, not everybody is actively involved. Not everybody's growing things in the polytunnel or buying firewood or walking their dog up there, but they're pleased it's happened. There's a willing acceptance of what has happened rather than necessarily an active engagement. And you won't get active engagement from everybody. It's a dream you won't get. Any community in this country, there'll be people who don't agree with everything. So you don't. But the control thing, the budget is, these things won't have great budgets. Knoydart in Scotland, I think, has an annual income from its forestry of about £300,000, and it does well to break even. So they're not going to be. I think the real trouble comes when you have big cash. But these are sustainable projects, economically sustainable, rather than gold mines which are just divvying out cash.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Chris. So we've got a final question, which is good timing. So the last question is from Patrick, and he says, on a resilience thought, are there particular risks that the communities are exposed to now, and will climate change constrain what you can do? I'm keen on reforestation for flood management and rewilding as carbon sinks, but to where we might see large-scale forest fires and, sorry, just move my cursor down, and then large-scale flooding following.
No, that's a really interesting, and we did consider climate change in our planning schedule, and we will do for the future. What that forest is going to need to look like in 50 years, and this is where it really helps having a long time scale, having a 100-year time scale. Well, what do we need to do with the land management plan, which will make it resilient for 100 years time? Both, so we need mixed species, we need other things. On the flood management thing, one of the things that's quite, and this is quite an issue in the Rhondda, what the community wants to do is move to continuous cover forestry. So you take out a few big trees occasionally rather than all of the trees at once, replant and wait 40 years and take them all down again. And that doesn't maximize your cash income now. You get more money getting a contractor in, cutting them all down, you get a bigger check. But of course, the aim is not to maximize the size of the check. The aim is to keep environment habitat. The idea is to stop erosion, to keep ground cover, to allow natural flood management, to create a better aesthetic environment, and to keep, and because continuous cover forestry has less reliance on machines and more reliance on labour, that keeps more of the income within the valley for the local workforce. So there are these multiple benefits come together from doing that. Climate change is one of the factors we just have to take into account. But again, you need the long time scale in order to be able to do that, and that's why I think it's important. So, and the best, to be honest, would be freehold. And this is what they've got in Scotland. These are freehold projects where they're holding that asset forever for the community's benefit. And I think that changes your perception of priorities and time and what you do.
Thanks, Chris. That's a nice note to end it on. Thank you so much for that. I think we've just about hit 1 o'clock, so timed it perfectly. So thank you, fascinating talk, lots and lots of things to think about, and perhaps you'll come back and speak to another webinar when the project's further along and we can learn more about how it's progressing. That'd be really, really interesting. And just to say, I'm very happy to, if people want to, you can share my email address, and if people want to follow up with email questions, then I'm very happy to do that. Lovely, great. If anyone would like Chris's contact details, let us know and we can pass those on. So yeah, thank you once again to Chris. Just to let you all know, we will make this available online within a week or so, is what we aim to do. We do have another webinar next week, so please do take a look at the programme, and if anything interests you, then please join us. So thank you very much again, Chris, and yeah, good afternoon, and bye-bye everyone. Thanks. Thanks everyone.